Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The memory of that night, a year ago now, is etched into me with the corrosive clarity of a bad dream you can't shake upon waking. The details not faded, but instead sharpened by the trauma that followed. And as I cling to this rain-slicked rooftop, the cold, rough grit of the shingles biting into my palms, the wind screaming a torrential fury that whips the stinging rain horizontally into my face, the entire world below me a churning, rising, hungry brown soup swallowing streets and cars and the familiar landmarks of my life, the very city groaning and cracking under the aqueous weight. I can't escape the grotesque symmetry of it all, the fact that we had, in our own foolish, frivolous way, been given a warning, a perfect, terrifyingly specific omen that we had dismissed as a trick of the mind, a collective spook, when in reality it was the absolute, logical, and terrifyingly mundane truth that we had simply been too afraid to accept, a truth we had spent a year meticulously ignoring. And it all started on an evening much like this one, or rather, the prelude to this one, with a storm brewing not in the apocalyptic crescendo we are now enduring, but in a low, grumbling threat on the horizon, the kind of rain that was just heavy enough to make the windows of Lena's apartment rattle softly, a comforting, rhythmic percussion against the glass that seemed to sync with the Bob Dylan album spinning on the turntable, the room itself a bastion of curated warmth against the gathering. Damp, filled with the scent of patchouli incense and the rich, earthy aroma of the mushroom tea she'd brewed. A gathering of the five of us, my chosen family, all of us bound by a shared, deep-seated anxiety that we wore as a badge of honor and a source of constant, low-grade despair. We were the environmentally conscious, the well-read, the ones who could quote the latest IPCC report chapter and verse, who understood the grim trajectory of the RCP scenarios, who knew with cold, scientific certainty that the stable world of our parents was a fleeting illusion. And that evening, the air was thick with it, with the unspoken dread that had been particularly potent since the release of another damning study about the increased frequency of 100-year weather events. A study we had all read and dissected in our group chat with a kind of masochistic fervor. And it was precisely to escape that weight, that crushing reality, that someone, I think it was Ben, had suggested we break out. The Ouija board, a kitschy, cardboard thing he'd found at a thrift store, a relic from the 70s with a lurid sunburst design, proposing it as a joke, a piece of ironic entertainment to distract us from the very real, non-ironic apocalypse simmering just outside the window, and we all agreed with a nervous laughter that was a little too loud, a little too forced. Because anything was better than sitting in silence with the knowledge that the foundations of our civilization were crumbling. So we cleared the coffee table of its empty wine bottles and dog-eared copies of The Uninhabitable Earth, lit a few more candles, and placed the board between us on the worn Persian rug, our knees touching in a circle, a parody of a seance. And I remember the feel of the planchette under our fingertips, a small, heart-shaped piece of plastic with a cloudy viewing window, its movement initially clumsy and giggly, our hands stacked on top of each other, a jumble of fingers and wrists, each of us. Secretly, I'm sure, trying to subtly influence its path as it zipped around the board to a chorus of our own mock spooky oaths, asking silly questions about who had a secret crush on whom, or what our spirit animals were. The answers nonsensical and fueled by Cabernet Sauvignon. But then, as the storm outside picked up, a sudden gust of wind howling down the chimney, causing the candle flames to gutter and dance, casting long, leaping shadows across our faces, the mood in the room shifted, the laughter dying in our throats, and it was Lena who, her voice quiet and strangely serious, asked, "Is there anything you actually want to tell us?" And that's when the planchette changed, the movement becoming not the clumsy, jerky shoves of before, but a smooth, deliberate, and unnervingly purposeful glide. A motion that felt independent of our own muscles, a force that guided our hands rather than the other way around, and it moved with a chilling certainty to the letters, spelling out. First, unmistakably, the name of our city, a simple, two-word name that felt like a physical blow in the quiet room. and we all froze, our eyes meeting in a shared moment of confusion and something else, something deeper. A flicker of recognition, of fear that was not supernatural but terrifyingly familiar. And before anyone could speak, before we could break the spell with a rationalization, the planchette moved again, sliding down to the numbers, pausing for a heart-stopping second on the 1. Then the 2, and then it stopped, hovering, and we held our breath, the only sound the frantic pounding of the rain and the ragged symphony of our own breathing. And then it resumed its journey, not to more numbers, but back to the alphabet, sliding with that same inexorable purpose to the letter F. Then L, then O, then another O, then D, and it stopped dead center, as if the word itself was a full stop, a period at the end of a sentence we hadn't known we were writing, and the word hung in the air between us, flood, a word so simple, so biblical, so stark, and in the silence that followed, you could feel the collective shudder that ran through us, a visceral, cold dread that had nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with the very real reports we had all read just that afternoon. Reports that specifically mentioned our river basin's increased vulnerability to catastrophic flooding. And then the spell broke, Ben snatching his hand away as if burned, laughing that same too loud, brittle laugh, saying, "Okay, that's enough of that. The power of suggestion is a hell of a thing." And we all quickly agreed, scrambling over each other with rationalizations, blaming the storm, the tea, our own suggestible minds, and we put the board away, shoving it back into its dusty box and banishing it to the back of Lena's hall closet. And we spent the rest of the night talking about anything else, our voices overlapping with a frantic energy. But the word was there, lodged in the back of my mind, a splinter of ice, a seed of terror that had been planted in the fertile soil of our shared anxiety. And in the days and weeks that followed, flood became a strange, private shorthand among us, a word we'd toss out with a nervous smirk when a heavy rain would start. A dark joke we used to deflect the genuine unease we felt, because the truth was, the Ouija board predicted the flood that drowned our city. But it wasn't a prediction at all, not in the prophetic sense. It was an echo, a vocalization of the data we had already consumed. The future we could already see barreling towards us with the grim inevitability of a glacier calving. And the year that unfolded was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance, a slow, steady slide into a state of passive, complicit denial. We went about our lives, we went to our jobs, we continued to read the increasingly dire climate news. We shared articles about the record-breaking heat in the oceans, the vanishing ice caps. The new models that showed our own city's flood defenses were critically inadequate for the new climate reality. And we would nod, we would sigh, we would feel that familiar pang of existential dread. And then we would order takeout, we would watch a movie, we would plan a weekend trip. We would do all the normal things, the tiny incremental acts of denial that added up to a colossal failure of imagination and will. And every time it rained, even a little, the word would whisper in the back of my head, flood. And I would push it down. I would tell myself that was just superstition, that the real world operated on science and probability, not on the movements of a piece of plastic on a cardboard board, but the horror, the true, profound horror that I am only now on this rooftop fully comprehending is that they were one and the same, that the science was the omen, the probability was the curse, and we were the willing participants in our own downfall, not out of malice, but out of a species-wide failure to act on knowledge that is too vast, too terrifying, to fully integrate into our daily lives. And so the year passed, the seasons turned, and the memory of that night faded into the background, a weird story to tell at parties, until this week, when the forecasts started coming in, serious forecasts from the National Weather Service, using language like historic, unprecedented, catastrophic, and we read them, of course we did, in our group chat, and there were a few concerned messages, but the response was muted, a collective, unspoken agreement to not panic, to wait and see, because what else could we do? The rain started yesterday morning, a steady, insistent drizzle that by afternoon had become a downpour, and by nightfall, a deafening roar on the roof, and the city's alerts started pinging on our phones, first advisories, then watches, then warnings, and still we hunkered down, Lena insisting her building was solid, a relic from a sturdier time. and we gathered there again, the five of us. The same group from that night a year ago, but the atmosphere was entirely different, the cozy warmth. Replaced by a grim tension, the power flickering and then failing entirely, plunging us into the dim, swaying light of the candles, the same candles from that night, which now felt not atmospheric but funereal. And we listened to the radio on Ben's phone, the battery dwindling, the voices of the reporters growing increasingly frantic as they reported the river breaching its levees in the north end of the city. And then the news came that the secondary flood walls, the ones the reports had said, were insufficient, had been compromised, and that's when the real fear set in, a cold, sharp fear that was entirely different from the spooky thrill of the Ouija board. This was a physical, immediate terror, and we watched from the window as the street below, our street, began to fill with water, not a gentle rising but a swift, relentless flow, a river where a road should be, carrying with it the detritus of our lives, garbage cans, branches, a child's bicycle, and then the cars began to float, bumping into each other with sickening, metallic crunches, and the water kept coming, rising up over the curbs, swallowing the sidewalks, climbing the stoops of the brownstones across the street. And we knew we had to move up, abandoning Lena's second-floor apartment for the third floor. And then, when the water started lapping at the top of the third-floor stairs, a thick, brown, foul-smelling liquid, we forced our way onto the roof, the wind and rain assaulting us with a violence that stole our breath. And that's where we are now, huddled together against the chimney, a pathetic island in a rising sea, watching our city die below us, the lights all gone out, the only illumination coming from the frequent, stark flashes of lightning that freeze the nightmare in tableau after terrifying tableau. A minivan perched on the roof of a newsstand, a body floating face down in the water that is now just a story below us. The eerie silence that follows the lightning, a silence broken only by the roar of the water and the occasional distant sound of a building collapsing. And it is in this moment, shivering uncontrollably, my clothes soaked through, my teeth chattering, that the final, devastating realization crashes over me with more force than any wave, the epiphany that is far more terrifying than any ghost or demon. The Ouija board didn't see the future, it saw us. It saw the fear that we carried in our hearts every single day, the knowledge we had diligently acquired and then carefully, methodically packed away in a mental box labeled later. It gave a voice to the silent scream of our climate anxiety, and we misinterpreted its source. We dressed it up in the comfortable clothes of superstition, because the alternative was too monstrous to face. The alternative was that we knew, we always knew, and we did nothing. We were like characters in a horror movie who hear the noise in the basement and decide to investigate with a flickering candle instead of running out the front door. And as I look at the faces of my friends, pale and stricken in the intermittent lightning, their eyes wide with the same horrific understanding, I know that we are all thinking the same thing, that we read the climate reports, we knew it was coming. The board just gave our fear a voice, a specific, undeniable voice that we chose to ignore. And the monster that is drowning our city isn't a vengeful spirit or a curse from beyond. It is the direct, physical manifestation of our collective inaction, the culmination of 1,000 small denials, a million ignored warnings. And the horror is not that something supernatural is happening, but that something entirely natural, something predicted by science and fueled by our own way of life, is happening. And we are trapped on a rooftop in the middle of it, survivors of a tragedy we authored ourselves. And the water is still rising, inch by inexorable inch, creeping up the slope of the roof towards our feet. And there is no one coming to save us, no deus ex machina, just the cold, patient, indifferent water and the crushing weight of the truth. The water is a living thing, a cold, patient entity that feels its way up the asphalt shingles, its leading edge a tongue of dark, debris-choked liquid that kisses the soles of my worn-out sneakers. And the sensation is not a shock, but a dreadful, expected intimacy, the final confirmation of a truth we have been fleeing for a year, a truth that now has us cornered on this shrinking island of tar and gravel. And Ben is muttering, a low, continuous stream of words that are lost to the wind, but whose meaning is clear in the frantic cadence. a litany of denial and panic, while Lena has gone preternaturally still, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the downtown skyline should be, but is now only a jagged, incomplete sketch against the bruised purple sky. A few taller buildings still defiantly piercing the low clouds, their upper floors probably filled with other huddled groups like ours, each facing their own private reckoning. And I think of my apartment, my third-floor walk-up with its shelves of books on climate science and its reusable grocery bags, and the signed petition to the city council to strengthen the flood defenses that I never got around to mailing. All of it now submerged, the ink on those pages bleeding into the water, the words dissolving, their warnings rendered meaningless by the very event they predicted. And the irony is a physical pain in my chest, a sharp, acidic burn that has nothing to do with the cold, and I remember with a sudden, vivid clarity the feel of the planchette under my fingers, the smooth, cool plastic, the way it seemed to pull our hands with a will of its own. Not a malicious will, but an inevitable one, like water finding its level. And I understand now that it was our own collective will, the unconscious, terrified knowledge that we all shared guiding that little plastic heart to spell out our fate. Because a flood wasn't just a possibility, it was the logical conclusion of every graph we had studied, every report we had cited at dinner parties to sound intelligent and concerned. It was the endpoint of the curve we were all riding, and the board was merely a tool, a focus that allowed our deepest, most repressed fear to manifest in a language we could understand, a language of letters and words, a language we could then conveniently dismiss as fantasy, because to accept it as reality would have demanded a response we were not capable of, a fundamental reshaping of our lives that felt impossible against the mundane gravity of daily existence. And now the cost of that impossibility is laid bare in the drowning world around us, a cost measured in the silent, dark windows of the houses across the street, houses where people may still be trapped in attics or on upper floors, waiting for a rescue that will not come because the emergency services are themselves underwater, their boats surely overwhelmed by the scale of this, and the rain, God, the rain does not stop. It is a billion tiny hammers beating a tattoo on the roof, a constant, maddening percussion that underscores the relentless rise of the water, which is now covering my ankles, the cold seeping through the fabric of my jeans, a deep, bone-aching cold that promises hypothermia, a slower, quieter end than drowning, but an end nonetheless. And Maria, who has been the quietest of us all, suddenly speaks, her voice cutting through the storm's roar with an unnatural calm, saying, "It knew the date too, didn't it? The one too. December. It's December now." And her words hang in the air, a final piece of the puzzle clicking into place with such devastating simplicity that I feel my knees buckle, and I have to grab onto the chimney bricks to stay upright. Because she's right, the planchette had paused on the 1 and the 2, and we had dismissed it as random, but it was the month, the exact month, the final, specific detail that our anxious minds had calculated from the seasonal weather patterns and the increased probability of winter storms, a detail we had buried even deeper than the word itself. And the confirmation is a verdict, a life sentence passed down not by a judge, but by our own ignored intellect. And I look at my friends, really look at them, their faces etched with a shared horror that has transcended fear and become a kind of bleak, absolute knowledge. And I know that if by some miracle we survive this, we will never be the same. The easy camaraderie we shared will be forever poisoned by this unspoken truth, that we saw the monster coming, and we did little more than give it a name before we went back to our lives. And the water is at my calves now, its pull stronger, the current created by the flow around the building tugging at my legs, suggesting the ease of surrender, of just letting go and allowing the brown water to take me. And for a moment the idea is seductive, a release from the crushing guilt. But then a sound cuts through the cacophony, a faint, high-pitched crying that at first I mistake for the wind, but it persists, a desperate, human sound, and we all turn our heads towards the source. A house 2 doors down where a single candle flickers in a 3rd-story window, and silhouetted against the light is a small figure, a child, waving its arms, and the crying grows louder, more frantic, and the horror of our situation multiplies exponentially, because we are not just witnesses to our own failure, but to the failure of an entire system, a society that knew and did not act. And we are trapped here, powerless to help, forced to listen to the sound of a child terrified and alone, a sound that is the true voice of the flood, the human cost of the data we ignored. And the Ouija board's message was never for us alone. It was a whisper of this scream, a preview of the agony that was always the inevitable consequence of the path we were on. And as the water climbs higher, as the cold numbs my body and the child's cries continue to pierce the night, I understand that the greatest terror is not the death that may be coming for me, but the knowledge that we were complicit in creating this world where such a sound is possible. And that is a horror from which there is no escape, not even in death. The child's cries become the only clock we have, each wail a measure of the rising water, which is now at our knees, the cold so profound it feels like a burning, a searing numbness that travels up my legs and settles deep in my bones, making every movement a slow, grinding effort against the weight of the river we now inhabit. And Ben is trying to shout across the churning gap to the other house, his voice a raw, torn thing that is shredded by the wind before it can travel 10 feet, his words turning into a meaningless groan of frustration and despair. And Lena has begun to move, a slow, deliberate shuffling towards the edge of the roof that faces the child's window, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on that flickering candle as if it were a star she could navigate by. And I want to grab her, to pull her back from the precipice, but my body is leaden, my mind a storm of its own, trapped in the loop of that night a year ago, the smell of incense replaced by the stench of mud and decay, the warm circle of friends replaced by this huddle of doomed survivors. And I see it all so clearly now, the exquisite cruelty of the omen, how it offered us a chance to be heroes in our own story, to hear a supernatural warning and spring into action, to become the eccentric group who saved the city because a ghost told them to. But we failed even that fictional test because the truth was too banal, too deeply woven into the fabric of our privileged lives, where crisis was something that happened on screens, in articles we shared with a sigh, not something that required us to actually leave our comfortable chairs. And the planchette's movement was our own subconscious screaming at us to do something, to make the connection between the abstract data and the tangible world. But we mistook the scream for a whisper, for a parlor game, and now the scream is real. It is the child's voice across the water, and it is the groan of the building beneath us, a deep, subterranean rumble that vibrates up through the water and into our teeth, a new sound that freezes us all, even Lena at the edge, because this sound is not the wind or the rain. It is the sound of foundation, of structure, of the very ground giving way, and we look at each other, our faces pale masks in the lightning flash, and in that instant there is no need for words. The understanding is absolute. Lena's building, this sturdy relic, is being undermined, its brick and mortar bones being chewed away by the current, and the rooftop is no longer a sanctuary but a tipping plane, a raft about to capsize, and the child's crying seems to sharpen, to become more insistent, as if it senses this new, final shift in our fortunes. And Maria begins to pray, not in words I can understand, but in a low, sobbing murmur in Spanish, her hands gripping the crucifix around her neck so tightly her knuckles are white bone. And Ben stops shouting and just slumps against the chimney, his body shaking with silent tears, the last of his rational defiance broken. And I find my eyes locked with Lena's, and in her gaze I see not fear, but a furious, blazing anger, a rage that is directed inward, at our collective failure, at the years of talking and reading and understanding that led only to this helplessness. And she takes one more step, the water now swirling around her thighs, and she raises her arms not in surrender, but in a gesture of defiance towards the sky, towards the unending rain, and she screams a single, guttural word that is lost to the storm, but which I know is the name of our city. The same name the planchette spelled out, a curse and a lamentation all in one. And as the building shudders again, more violently this time, a great lurch that sends a wave washing over the entire roof, forcing us to grab onto anything solid, the chimney, the vent pipes. I realized that the final horror is not the death that is now so imminent, but the absolute certainty that we deserve this, not as a punishment from God or fate, but as the direct physical consequence of our actions, or rather, our profound and catastrophic inaction. And the Ouija board was never a gateway to the spirit world. It was a mirror held up to our own souls, and we saw the reflection of the flood not because it was prophesied, but because we had already built it, brick by negligent brick, report by ignored report. And we are now simply living in the world we constructed, a world of water and regret. And the child's cries are the sound of that construction, the human cost of the foundation we laid. And as the building groans one last time, a deep, final sigh of surrender, and begins to slide, the roof tilting at a sickening angle, the cold, dark water rising to meet us as we lose our grip and are thrown into the churning chaos. The last thing I am aware of is not the water filling my lungs, but the overwhelming, suffocating weight of the truth, a truth more terrifying than any ghost. We always knew, and we did nothing. The world upends in a roar of tearing brick, and a scream that is either the wind or my own voice ripped from my throat as the roof tilts from a sanctuary into a slide, a violent slope of wet shingles pitching us into the churning blackness. And the cold is an absolute, a shock that paralyzes the lungs and steals the very thought of breath. My body tumbling end over end in the dark, chaotic soup, limbs flailing against unseen obstacles, a glancing blow against what feels like a floating timber, a sharp pain in my shoulder that is instantly numbed by the all-consuming cold, and my mind, detached in its final moments, does not see my life flash before my eyes, but instead replays that single, stupid moment with the planchette, the smooth glide to the F, the collective intake of breath, the nervous laughter that was the first brick in our tomb. And I understand now that the horror was never in the prediction, but in the certainty of it, the absolute scientific inevitability that we dressed up as a ghost story to make it more palatable, to give ourselves an out, a supernatural scapegoat for a catastrophe of our own making. And the water is in my mouth, my nose, a thick, gritty liquid that tastes of soil and gasoline and decay, the true flavor of our modern world. And I am not fighting it. My body has given up the struggle, my muscles rendered useless by the cold and the devastating acceptance that this is the end we chose, the logical conclusion of every car we drove, every flight we took, every plastic bottle we threw into the recycling bin with a faint hope that someone else would solve the problem. And the darkness behind my eyes is not empty, but filled with the faces of my friends, Lena's defiant scream, Ben's broken slump, Maria's fervent prayer, each a testament to a different way of facing the truth we had ignored. And I wonder if they are already gone, their own internal monologues silenced by the water, their guilt absolved in the only way possible. And the current pulls me down, a relentless force that feels like a hand, not a spectral hand from a Ouija board, but the hand of consequence itself, heavy and undeniable. And just as the last of my air escapes in a silent bubble, a final surrender, my body is slammed against something solid, something that yields but holds, a tangled mass of branches and wreckage that has formed a temporary dam against the current, and some primal instinct, a spark against the overwhelming void of acceptance, makes my hands clutch at the branches, my head breaking the surface in a ragged, choking gasp that draws in air along with the filthy water. And I am vomiting, heaving, clinging to this accidental raft made of the bones of the city's parks. And the world is reduced to sound, the roar of the water and my own desperate, retching breaths. And when I can finally see, wiping the stinging water from my eyes, the scene is one of absolute surreal devastation, a landscape reshaped by liquid, buildings half submerged like sleeping giants, the tops of streetlights casting weak, lonely circles of light on the swirling surface. And the crying has stopped, the child's window is dark, a silence that is more terrible than any sound, and I am alone, utterly alone, clinging to a mat of debris in the center of what was once my neighborhood, the current slowly spinning my makeshift raft in a lazy circle, showing me the full, panoramic horror of the flood that we predicted, that we joked about, that we knew with every fiber of our informed beings was coming. And the rain is finally beginning to lessen, not a cessation but a slackening, the furious downpour becoming a steady, mournful drizzle, as if the sky itself is exhausted from its violence, and in this eerie half-light, the pre-dawn gray fighting through the storm clouds, the truth settles upon me with a weight heavier than the water, the thrilling, terrifying end of the story. That survival is not a victory, but a sentence, a life condemned to remember that the monster was not in the board but in us, and that every breath I take from this moment on is a breath drawn in a world we drowned with our own hands. And the Ouija board didn't curse us, it simply held up a mirror, and we were too afraid to look at our own reflection until it was reflected back at us in the rising floodwaters. And now, alone in the silence broken only by the lap of water against ruins, the mirror is all there is, and the reflection is forever changed. The current carries me a slow, solemn procession past the graves of familiar places. The cafe where we would discuss carbon offsets, now a dark cave with chairs floating like pale mushrooms inside. The bookstore where I bought all those climate texts submerged to its green awning, the words inside bleeding away into the same water that holds me. And the silence is a presence now, a thick, heavy blanket smothering the world, broken only by the occasional groan and crack of a building settling into its watery grave, a sound that seems to echo deep within my own chest. And the sky lightens from a bruised purple to a sickly, washed-out gray, revealing the full, monstrous scale of the destruction. An inland sea stretching to the horizon, dotted with the jagged ruins of rooftops and treetops. A landscape from a nightmare painted in shades of mud and despair. And I am a speck on this vast, brown canvas, clinging to my raft of splintered wood and torn-up shrubs, every shiver a reminder of the cold that has sunk into my marrow, a cold that feels permanent, the new baseline temperature of my existence, and my mind, unmoored from the immediate terror of drowning, begins its grim inventory, not of what I have lost, but of what I have contributed, every forgotten recyclable, every unnecessary car journey, every time I chose convenience over conviction, each a tiny drop in the ocean that now surrounds me. And the memory of the planchette is a brand on my brain, its path across the board etched with the clarity of a surgical scar, and I understand that its movement was the purest expression of our collective consciousness, a truth we could not speak aloud, so it used our fingers to spell it out, a desperate, final attempt by our own psyches to make us see what was right in front of us, and we, in our profound arrogance, dismissed it as entertainment, and the weight of that dismissal is heavier than the waterlogged clothes dragging at my body. It is an anchor on my soul. And I see a shape floating towards me, a dark lump that my heart desperately hopes is debris, but which, as it draws nearer, resolves into the grim, unmistakable form of a body, face down, arms outstretched, clothed in the familiar fabric of a neighbor's winter coat. And I cannot look away. I am forced to witness this intimate tragedy as the current brings it within feet of my raft, a silent accusation passing by, a casualty of the future we knew was coming. And the horror is no longer a feeling, but a state of being, a fundamental truth of my new reality, that I am alive in a cemetery of my own making, and the faint hope of rescue that flickers somewhere in the back of my mind feels like a betrayal, because what would I be rescued to? A world that continues to ignore the same truths we did, a life spent trying to explain the unexplainable, that the Ouija board knew my climate anxiety, because my climate anxiety was the only real thing in the room that night. A monster we had lovingly fed with data and graphs until it grew large enough to swallow our city. And as the gray day wears on, the drizzle finally ceasing, leaving a world washed clean of its past and horrifyingly new, I hear a sound, a distant, mechanical thrum that is not the natural voice of the flood, and I look up to see a helicopter, a tiny black insect against the vast sky, moving slowly over the drowned city, and a part of me wants to wave, to scream, to claw towards survival, but a larger, more terrifying part simply watches it pass, a silent observer to my own potential salvation, because the thought of being pulled from this water, wrapped in a blanket, and told that everything will be okay is the greatest horror of all, a lie so profound it would negate the entire truth of this experience, the truth that nothing will ever be okay again, that the world we knew is gone, and we are the ones who broke it, And as the sound of the helicopter fades into the distance, I let go of the branch, not to drown, but to simply float, to be a part of the consequence, to finally stop fighting the truth I have known for a year, a truth spelled out in letters on a cardboard board, that we are not victims of a prophecy but architects of a flood, and the water that holds me is the physical manifestation of our failure, and to survive it is to be forever haunted not by a ghost, but by the echo of our own inaction, a silence more deafening than any storm.